You know it's a John Truby video when you have a four-corner opposition in your notebook. Hey everyone, I'm Nicole Wilbur. I'm a writer and I am starting to plot a new thriller book. Let me back up a second. We're going to be talking all about anatomy of genre, but to kind of understand where I am, I just have to give you a little bit of background on my process, so bear with me for 1 second because we are about to dive deep into chapter 12, I believe, of anatomy of genre and talk all about how this works and how we can apply this to our own stories. So, just for a little bit of background, is I am the kind of writer, is this a kind where I start trying to outline, get impatient, start writing the book, and then somewhere between like 12 and 20K, realize I need an outline for the book. So I, about a month and a half ago, started cheating on the book I was supposed to be working on with this thriller, which is a YA, it's a YA thriller. I'm used to saying heist thriller, but it's not a heist. It's a normal action-packed thriller. It's set in the rainforest. It's very like conservation based. There is an embassy angle. It's Costa Rica. It's Panama. It's really, really fun. And so I have been writing this thing, going off, having so much fun pantsing it. And now I'm at the point where I'm like, I think she's supposed to be solving a crime and I don't think I can pants clues. So I pulled up handy dandy John Truby's Anatomy of Genre. Now this book, I have not read this book cover to cover, but I have read sections of this book like 15,000 times. It's a long book and there's a lot in it, but there's a lot of really, really good stuff. Basically with this book, he was not only trying to kind of help you figure out how to write a story in said genre, but was really trying to get to the heart of why these genres exist, why they grip people so much, and almost help us have a better understanding of like our lives as a whole. I think I paraphrased that from the intro. So we are going to go through the chapter 12 detective story and thriller, The Mind and the Truth. Now, a couple of years ago, I suggested a way for working through anatomy of genre. There's anatomy of story and anatomy of genre. I'm not used to saying anatomy of genre. We gotta focus. And my suggestion was really to put everything you knew about your story on one side and then all of the kind of plot elements he gives you on the other and try to do some matching. That's the gist of it. I'll link it up below and in the Substack article as well if you're interested in that. But basically, we are going to do something like that. We're basically going to go through and we're going to chat about what is in this chapter and try to figure out how we write a thriller because honestly, who the hell knows? So the chapter starts with talking about Sherlock Holmes and the origin of the genre. Conan Doyle is the finest practitioner. Edgar Allan Poe. Who knew? Edgar Allan Poe invented the detective genre. And then he talks about detective story and the thriller. The very interesting thing, of course, about a detective story and a thriller story is that in most stories, you know who the opponent is the whole time. And like that's kind of key. The opponent is like right there and you have conflict. But in the detective and the thriller story, the opponent is hidden. And so you're kind of flipping it up. It also says here that it's the most complex plot of any genre story. And again, that's because you don't know who the opponent is. When I think about this, I always think about like Harry Potter, how I think it worked so well because it was kind of like a whodunit, like who stole the thing. It was kind of like a detective type story within an action story because Harry had very clear opponents right in front of him, but he also had a hidden opponent. And that's the case for almost all of the books. You can say that for Chamber of Secrets. You can kind of say that for Prisoner of Azkaban. You can definitely say that for Goblet of Fire. So that pattern was continued, and I think it's really, really interesting in the form. And it does make things more complex. And there's a bit in here, and I think this is really interesting too, is really like stories have become more and more like this. Like now we're seeing stories that literally have actual puzzles in them, right? Like Bianca Murray's new book, A Most Puzzling Murder, which I'm so excited to read, it's on my TBR, has a freaking like puzzles in it that you solve, like an escape room in a book. Because story has started like very pure action, like The Myth, and has become more and more about this like intellectual engagement, which is one of the things that I love about story. So, through these key points, I said that one of John Truby's goals was to kind of get to the bottom of why we love this genre. The great insight of the detective mind action story review is that life is about comparing stories to learn what is really true. So basically, he always says that the hero and the opponent of any story have the same goal. And in the detective and thriller story, it's about which version of the story will people believe, basically. Which version, whose version of the truth will someone believe, even if it's not the truth? You get the point. We can keep going now. All right. Okay, so as we keep going through here, we have a comparison between detective thriller and other genres, which is very interesting. And then we have a comparison between detective and thriller themselves, and this was extremely helpful for me. So I am going to read this bit out loud. I don't want to give too many like verbatim quotes because obviously you should buy the book, but God, this book is huge. So I'm hoping that a couple quotes from me will be fine. Okay, so a detective story typically involves a murder that has already happened, whereas a thriller involves a murder that is yet to occur. Interesting point, and I see it. One of the examples of a thriller they gave was Day of the Jackal. I'm pretty sure he meant the movie, but I just saw the TV show and I'm like, yes, that whole story was about a murder that's about to occur. Interesting point for me though, is that in my story, which I think is fairly normal for the genre, there is a murder that has already occurred. That was the big kind of change I made, that the murder has occurred. And that's sort of the kickoff and the inciting incident for the story. I feel like that's fairly typical and not a big deal, but there is also a murder of sorts. There's something to come. I haven't quite figured, I know what the stakes are. I know what my character is trying to fight against. It's not exactly a murder, but hopefully it has the stakes of one. It is the destruction of something. Although I could somehow in there have another murder, like she's gonna kill again or something, which is a possibility, but I'm not sure. I feel like in YA thrillers we get this a lot, where there's a murder at the beginning and then throughout the kid starts getting notes being like, stop investigating this, and then like there's gonna be another murder and it's gonna be them because the person's trying to clear up their tracks. And that actually brings me to this point. In a detective story, the hero is a professional investigator, a private eye, and therefore trained. In a thriller, the hero is usually an untrained average person who sees something suspicious and looks into it. Now, I think in detective, you can say like Nancy Drew, but she does have like tricks of the trade. And I think that's why a lot of in YA, all of the sort of mystery stories where someone is investigating really end up being thrillers, because it's an untrained average person. Detective is capable with fists and carries gun. Thriller, no ability to fight. And then detective, many suspects. Thriller, one main suspect. One main suspect. Yeah, and we'll keep going into that. I think that's really interesting because I think in a thriller, like what we see in a lot of YA thrillers, I'm thinking of A Good Girl's Guide to Murder. I'm thinking of The Ivies. They do kind of like smell in the crossover there, where it has elements of a thriller. It has a lot of elements of detective, because they're usually not being chased till like the end bit, at least the midpoint. They get their scary note, you know? So that's just an interesting thing to mention. Oh my God, I did my hair. Okay, we have a little bun. Okay, continuing on. The next bit is about combining genres, mentioning that love and thriller go really well together. So does love and detective, and that's super interesting. We'll come back to that. Then we get lots of examples, blah, blah, blah. Okay, and this is the part of the chapters that I always find most helpful, and it is the overview. So we're gonna hit the, oh my God. Okay, we're just gonna take it down. We're going to hit the detective thriller story beats, the detective theme, the thriller theme, and then we're not going to really talk about how to transcend because I don't think I'm transcending, and you can read that part if you're interested, but there's the word cosmic in there, and I'm like, well, okay. For me, there's this restaurant that I used to go to called Cosmic Crab, and so I hear cosmic and I'm like, it's either about space or it's about crabs. I don't know. All right, so one of the things that I will say is a small critique of this book is that I don't know, I understand why he combined detective and thriller, but at certain times, like the subtitle is always detective and thriller beat, I believe. However, sometimes it's not actually the thriller beat, it's like more for one or the other, and I found it kind of hard to go through and differentiate. I guess because you do see a lot of crossover of certain tropes and things, but anyways, just given my feedback. Okay, so the thriller story strategy: place hero in a tightening vice and show them trying to escape by finding the truth. I think that is a really cool kind of thing to just have in the back of my head when writing, because yeah, they're trying to escape by finding out the truth. That's pretty damn powerful. Okay. Story beat is opponent's plan to commit murder. All detective stories begin with a murder. There we go. There's the detective thing again. And then I kind of have to skim, blah, 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 and be like, is that true of the thriller? And we'll find that no. The opponent does two things at the beginning of the story. He commits a crime and tries to cover it up. And then we get to a technique. Okay, so thrillers don't have to begin with murders. Detectives do. But here's the technique, and this is the technique that I started working on. Opponent's plan first. Always begin by figuring out the opponent's plan. This is how I think I'm going to be able to continue to pants this book while not exactly pantsing it. I want to come up with my goal for like the next couple days is to come up with the opponent's plan. And I have, some of it here. And then just kind of pants how the character is going to solve it. Because if I have the problem and their plan, I can figure out kind of how the character will get around those things. And they'll have to be, creative and stuff. So I think this is really, really useful. Figuring out the opponent's plan, great technique. I think when I was doing a heist story, I found that, again, very helpful because you have to figure out like what the security is going to be, what the initial plan is going to be, and what the changed plan is going to be in order to like write the story. Just like in this one, you have to figure out what the opponent's plan is going to be, I believe, in order to then like plant clues to figure out their plan, So there's a little bit of working backwards. I think that's a really great technique. Another technique is the ingenious opponent. Basically, you want the opponent to be, strong, very, very intelligent, very smart. I came up with, oh my God, okay. My book has, I showed you, it has a web of opponents, and one of them does commit a murder at the beginning. And I am so excited about how this murder gets committed, guys. I'm so excited. I want to, when you have an idea and you're like, I have come up with the absolute best way to do anything ever. You know what I mean? Like I'm at that phase with it. I'm sure I will get a million people who are like, oh, this has been done before, But at the moment, I'm very proud of myself for coming up with how it's all going to be done. Okay, going back to here. In thriller, the crime may have already occurred, but more often the investigator is trying to prevent it from happening. But the first step of determining the opponent's plan is the same. Very, very helpful. Next story beat is the story world. Detective story is an enslaving society. And then in the thriller, it says the world is typically average, but there's also the political thriller where you have the city. Sometimes I tend to get lost when we talk about the city and the forest and the town and all this stuff. I know the cozy house, the haunted house, the blah, 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 I read Anatomy of a Story. I've read all about the settings. Everything else connects with me. That one connects with me like part of the way, I feel like a lot of it, because film is so visual, I think that's where it comes from, is I'm sometimes like, how do I show this in a book, All right, as we keep going, we hear the hero's role is the search for truth. We already talked about how the hero is not a professional. Here we have, okay, then there's a really interesting bit. It's a beat, which is the detective's ghost. So we all know that heroes have a ghost that's usually there, but the technique suggested here is that the weakness matches the crime. And I find that really interesting. The basic idea is that the basic idea is that the weakness matches the crime, in that the opponent solving the crime has to force the character to confront their weakness, right? I'm going through a whole bunch of this because I don't want to, again, say it out loud. But here it is, the weakness story. Weakness is not just something embedded in the character that hurts as she goes about her daily life. The character has created a story about her weakness that blames others and hides the flaw from her understanding. Often this story includes the ghost. And so basically what I think is interesting here is that you can already hear, so she's created a story about her weakness that blames others and hides the flaw from her understanding. Detective and thriller stories are about uncovering the truth. And so I think it's really ingenious that we're tying those two things together. A detective is searching for the true story about the murder and herself. In the thriller, it mentions that in the thriller, the hero is in deep emotional danger, and that's typically part of their weakness, perhaps. Yes, sorry. And that's a big part of it, and that their weakness should make them more susceptible to physical danger, so we are afraid for them. I feel like, again, there's a lot of crossover, so I think it's interesting, the idea that, like, the flaw she would uncover as she is investigating. And it's also important that there's a weakness that makes her more susceptible to danger, so we're afraid for her. It says thriller is all about high-intensity emotions, which totally makes sense. I'm very excited to do that. We talked about this. Another technique that I have notes on that I'm so excited about is this idea that in the love and the thriller plot, you can make the hero basically confront their skepticism in love by having, like, making the leap of faith in love being connected to solving the plot. I love that technique. I'm like, I'm using that. Yes, writing that down. That's great. Beautiful. So excited for that. Mine is kind of a second chance romance in the thriller. I don't know. That's what it is. So very excited about that. Okay. We keep going. We have a story beat, which is desire. We love the story beat desire. And then we have a bit that's all about shapes. Again, I'm not a visual person. I just got to keep going. The shape stuff, I got nothing for. Okay, and then we get to talking about opponents and how to design really good opponents. There's a technique here called the iceberg opponent, where we're revealing information about the opponent in pieces. And then there's another technique about having more suspects. So there's a suggestion that, yes, a thriller doesn't necessarily need more than one suspect, but having multiple suspects can be really great. They give 3 requirements of suspects, which is super awesome. And and there's a technique for decreasing suspicion, so taking the stink off one character. We also have a note that the opponent should attack the main character's greatest emotional weakness, especially with the weapons of guilt and fear. And there's some examples of that in here, which is super helpful. Okay. This is where we get to that detective versus thriller issue again, because here we have detective and thriller story beat, plan, investigation. And there is a very good 6-step investigation here that detectives should go through. But then they're kind of like, well, the thriller hero is an amateur, so the story is about her fear. She hits the same investigative beats, but she does it more on intuition. I think that's really interesting. I think these beats are super interesting. One thing for me is that, like, there's a crime scene, kind of, there's a murder, but then the character has to go on the run. So I'm like, that makes it complicated and interesting, because I don't know how we are going to observe physical evidence or clues or recreate the crime. Maybe I'll be creative, I'll figure it out. But still, like, go on the run. And I have a note somewhere as I was reading this book that originally I planned on her starting in Costa Rica, going to Panama, ending in Panama City, and the big climax happening there. However, I end the book, like, basically ending there. Except then I realized that for her to solve the murder crime situation, she's got to go back to Costa Rica, to where she started. And so that is putting a little bit of a wrinkle in my plan for the book, even though there's no plot, it's just in my head, but that's okay. Yeah, so that one's interesting because to like uncover the one thing, she has to be in Panama City. To uncover the other thing, she has to be in Costa Rica. Who knows? I'm like, could I just have someone on FaceTime in Costa Rica? But I feel like that is losing some momentum. I don't know. We'll have to think. We'll have to come back to that point. Okay, continuing on. Now we go into in-depth in the different investigation steps, which I am just going to kind of continue over here. One thing that I did, and I'll link some videos below, is that I started looking into different kinds of clues because I was like, what could a clue even be? You know what I mean? I was Googling like, what could a clue be? And I found a list on someone's website of like correspondence, DNA, and stuff like that. I also found a really good video from, I think it was Jane Combs, who talks about the onion clue, the cover-up clue, the back pocket clue. I thought these were all really interesting concepts, and they helped me come up with the plan. And I'm starting to come up with some of the clues here. Like the onion clue, the example was the investigator found a name written on a piece of paper. Turns out the name was actually the name of a boat, and then the important thing about the clue was actually the paper it was written on. And so I have notes in mind like, okay, like what clue could they get first that is a red herring or that seems like it's something else, and then if you look deeper, it is something more. We are continuing on. This is a good point. Technique: determine reveals up front. Create the reveals when you figure out the opponent's plan at the beginning of the writing process. That is what I am trying to do now, because again, the quality of a detective story is the quality of the reveals. We have notes here on red herrings, on sequences of reveals. I notice here that a revelation must be triggered by a specific physical clue. That's super interesting. The thriller reveal is usually about the evidence of the main suspect's guilt. I wrote this down in my notebook actually, that there's typically a crosscut between finding evidence the suspect committed the crime and finding evidence the suspect did not commit the crime. It says make these lines fairly even, and there's 2 critical reveals to that nature towards the end of the story. All right, then we have some beats and some techniques around red herrings. Double clue is very much the same as kind of that onion clue, the clue that seems like it's something but is actually something else, or the clue that's initially a red herring, but if you look at it differently, it's true. Oh my God, we're only on investigative step 2. There is so much meat and goodness in here. Like I spent a couple hours just making jot notes down. Like I have thriller, hero, weakness, deep emotional danger, like iceberg opponent. Like I went through and jotted stuff down, but it just like, there's so much to think of and to process. All right, we're continuing through all of these investigative beats. Okay. Reveal of the killer's fatal mistake. There's a discussion of that. The fact that there should be something subtle that the killer does that we can then figure out. The final reveal must be the biggest. The person who commits the crime should be least likely. And then we continue. There's a note on opponent's final attack for thriller. The opponent must discover that the hero knows of his guilt and attack. The hero must fight back from a point of extreme weakness. Last second solutions, etc. There's a lot in here. And then we get to, okay, so we went through everything. We went through a whole section on investigative beats. And now we're at the moral argument of poetic justice. Now, poetic justice is very powerful in detective. And then here I am again trying to figure out, where is thriller in here? Like, what is thriller moral argument? I don't know. I can't find it. My skimming is not working. Maybe it's the same thing. Maybe it's poetic justice still. I don't know. All right. Then we get to thriller theme. Being is uncovering our true enemies. And so now we're into the theme part, and we have a lot more philosophizing about like the thematic recipe and how basic actions like combine together to have the final act, etc. And there we go. The last bit about the thriller is that it's finding the truth about our loved ones. And so it's pointing out that often the thriller is, or the opponent is super connected to the hero in thrillers, and that having it hit close to home is very, very important. Whereas in a detective story, you expect it to be like one of the suspects. In the thriller, it's kind of, I don't know, it's usually like someone's dad. I don't know. Someone's dad, or like your best friend's boyfriend or something like that. And that is your thematic recipe. To live well, we must stand up to those who we believe are hurting us, even if it may only be in our head. The alternative is that we live the rest of our days in a bondage we have helped create. And then we get into the transcendent stuff, which I'm not going to touch on. So how I'm approaching this is a little messy. I don't know if you can tell that. There's so much more. There's still a lot more in this chapter. I highly recommend this book. Like the number of techniques, I just spent 25 minutes kind of going through like 10% of it. But how I'm approaching it is looking at the opponent's plan and really focusing on those two things mentioned: evidence the suspect didn't, evidence they didn't. Looking at it from the opponent's perspective, what I've thought of mostly is that, you know, the opponent's plan, there's multiple opponents. So I need to have one opponent's plan, the other, and everyone needs to have their own plan, and they need to intersect and weave in ways that make it more complex and go together. I've also been doing a lot of research. I think that's a good key in detective stories too, is to research the area you're playing in. Mine is conservation, it's resort building, land permits, environment. There's also a touch of like diplomacy involved. So I've been doing a lot of research on like, what can embassies do, and how does one get a permit to build a mega resort in a rainforest? I don't know. My character does though, so we gotta figure that out. And I'm starting to write out the plan, and I really think that writing out the plan explicitly of like, I am overseeing the development of 5 resorts across Central America. I want blah blah blah, like in step by step is going to be super duper helpful. So I'm not sure what that video was. Really just me going through the thriller section of Anatomy of Genre and talking about the pros and cons of it. That's what I'm using for outlining my story. I have these things on kind of sticky notes around me or in my book where they're dropping off. I'm really focusing on the opponents right now and the red herrings, the false clues. I feel like if I nail that, everything else will fall into place, just like the book said. So, have you read the Anatomy of Story or Anatomy of Genre, I suppose? What did you think of it? If you like this video, give it a big thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe if you're not. Check out my Substack below as well if you prefer things in written format. I tend to send emails out on Fridays, and right now, if you become a paid Substack subscriber, you get I'm willing to do kind of a peer-to-peer critique, up to 10 pages of your work. So, yeah, if that sounds interesting to you, go check it out. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.